All right, tonight's guest, she's been a model, a rock and roll muse. She's been married to Mick Fleetwood twice. She's was the sister-in-law to both George Harrison and Eric Clapton. She's also written songs for Fleetwood Mac, if you didn't know that. But lesser known, and more importantly, she's also a scholar with a master's in counseling psychology and a doctorate in humanities. She's a therapist who specialized in addiction, and she also has owned a company. Gosh, that's a lot. She's authored several books, including her appropriately titled autobiography, Jennifer Juniper. Now she brings us icons of rock and roll. In their own words, it's an extensive collection of words straight from artists like George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Mick Fleetwood, and the likes. Please welcome from England, by way of Ojai, Jenny Boyd. How do you find Santa Barbara?
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. Can I live here?
Oh, by all means. By all means.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're more than welcome to live here. You know what I have to say before we start, it cracks me up when I heard you on an interview and you say my brother-in-law George or my brother-in-law Eric. Like, it's so casual when you have two of the greatest rock and roll figures. And I think of, I go, my brother-in-law David isn't that accomplished, and I feel a little bit inadequate.
Oh,
no. So. But, you know, I have to ask, what comes to your mind when that pops in your head? It's so natural to say it because they were your brothers-in-law.
Yeah. I mean, George I met when I was 16, and he was like my big brother. And, you know, the fact that when I would hear songs like All You Need Is Love, which I did, I remember when I was in San Francisco for 6 months in 1967, I didn't think, oh, there's my brother-in-law singing. I just thought, that's the Beatles. So it was a sort of separation. George was very different.
Interesting. But your whole life, I mean, you just seemed to treat it like it was just an everyday thing, like the rest of us live our daily lives. And your daily life happened to be with some of the greatest creative minds. You were in the ashram with the Beatles, of course, Fleetwood Mac, and you've known all these people. And does it just feel normal to you, just regular?
Yeah, because I think, you know, say, as you were saying in the ashram, I was 19, and you don't think about the future, or you don't think anything other than the present when you're that age. You don't think, one day I'll look back on all this at all. You're just living it. I mean, to me, what was even more inspiring than, say, the Beatles being there was looking at the Himalayas. You know, it was just, it's different.
I'm having a hard time grasping this because you had such an amazing life. And I looked at this book and all the interviews, like, you know, I'll call out one of our regular customers, Jackson Brown, comes here. People like that are still performing, but others like George and Santa Barbara's own David Crosby have passed away. They're sadly gone. And I was just wondering, in the context of this whole book, are you able to look at the big picture of how these people have lived their lives, or were you just focused on each individual person when they told you their stories?
I focused on each individual person. So it started off with, because, you know, obviously Mick was my husband and knew Fleetwood Mac really well. So I started off with those, but also my second husband, Ian Wallace, who played with King Crimson and Dylan and all those kind of stuff, musicians. He was playing with Don Henley, Jackson Brown, Bonnie Raitt, Crosby, Stills and Nash. So I had all those that were happy to be interviewed. And then it just went on from there. I just needed to, it was sort of as if there was a lot of synchronicity. It's like I just needed to think of somebody, say Ravi Shankar, I'd like to interview him, and someone said, oh, I know, he's staying at that hotel in Santa Monica. You know, so it was like that all the time. It was almost, you know, and I can't even remember how I got B.B. King or Willie Dixon. I went to Willie Dixon's house and interviewed him there, and not long actually before he passed away. But it was just incredible. Peter Gabriel, just all these people, because I can't imagine getting people of that caliber nowadays, it's so difficult. Everybody's got about 5 managers, or it's much more. It's not as easy.
You have to go through the corporations to get to the individual.
Yeah. But one thing I just have to say that they all had in common was this incredible humility. All these great musicians, very famous and could have had a, amazing sort of thinking of themselves as wonderful, but no, they all had the humility. And I think that was a sort of an awareness that often they didn't feel it was them, that the lyrics or whatever it was coming through them. It wasn't theirs. And some of them would get that sort of while they were asleep and had to write it down, or they didn't think, well, most of the time obviously there's a lot of hard work to it, but there's the inspiration that comes as well.
Interesting.
So yeah,
I really like the fact that how you built it seemed all organic, like you were just talking about. I mean, as opposed to you going out and getting 75, right?
There were 75 in the first book.
Yeah.
Then here, I'm not sure how many we got. We might have about 75. Yeah, there were a couple, 2 or 3 I left out. But with the difference with this book is that I have to tell you, and I think it was a terrible thing to do, but I did do it, and that is I had all these, because at that time it was cassette tapes. 75 cassette tapes of all the interviews. And I was living in LA at that time, and I kept them in a bank vault. And then sometime a few years later, I went over to England, so I took all these to England. And then I moved around, and I was in England, dragging them around with me. And my biggest fear was that I might lose them, or somebody might steal them. And they had trusted me, and some interviews were definitely not for public ears, you would want to protect them. And so what I did after about 25 years of carrying them around, I sat down and started ripping up the tapes, except for 7. And the 7 that weren't destroyed was George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Joni Mitchell, Don Henley, who else? Ravi Shankar.
Wow.
Yeah. And wonderful jazz drummer Tony Williams, and Graham Nash. And so this book has got the whole interview. It's got the question, and it's got all their answers. Joni Mitchell, and they were done in between 1988 and 1990.
Okay, so you kept those tapes. That's why they're longer, but some of them are a little bit shorter.
And the ones that are shorter, the book that was the dissertation was obviously a bit more sort of dissertation-like, and so the chapters would be like the collective unconscious, or drugs and alcohol, and you would just take a snippet from, say, Peter Gabriel or whoever it was, and you put it in there. So what I did now, say with Keith Richards, or all of them that I didn't have the tapes, is I just got all the bits out of the musicians in tune and put them in one. So that's why they're shorter.
It's interesting. You have a format that I really like, because it seems when you read this book, it feels like you're in the living room or in the studio with them listening. But you have a certain structure, and that includes, you have them talk about family, you have them talk about creativity, spirituality, psychic influences sometimes, and also drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering why you chose to put it in that format. It works perfectly, but I was just curious about your choices, why you did that.
Well, because the whole reason why I started this was because I never felt creative. And yet I'd been around since the age of sort of 16, around very creative people. And so when I had to think what I wanted to write about for this dissertation, it was obvious to me there must be other people who feel they're not creative, and that if I can find out what these musicians are saying, then maybe that will help those who feel they're not creative. And I asked them all, do you think we have the potential to be creative? And they all say yes. And they say, in different ways. Joni Mitchell says it her way, or the thing that stops people sometimes is fear of failure. And so that was my drive to do that.
That was beautiful, the fact that everybody said it's very heartening if you're a writer, you're a painter, you're a musician, and I'm sure some of you are, that they would say that because it gives hope in terms of what you say.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be obvious creativity. It can be done in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah. And I was wondering about, there's so many gems in this work, and you can just, the beauty of this book, you don't have to do it in order. You don't have to read in order, correct?
Yeah.
You can just say, I want to read about Mike Rutherford from Genesis and Mike and the Mechanics, or I want to Anthony Kiedis. And I love that fact, and there's so many gems that you write, and I was wondering if you were willing to share one or two of these gems that are in the book without spoiling the book.
Yeah. Who should we pick? You can choose it, Michael.
Richard Thompson.
Richard Thompson?
Yeah.
Really?
I love Richard
Thompson. Oh, sorry.
Thompson. Is that a bad choice?
No.
Okay. One of the greatest guitarists around.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, do you want? Well, there's actually.
Oh, you found something.
Yeah.
What should we?
Maybe read that one.
Okay. When you inflict your creativity on other people, say an audience, you're very aware of what you can do to an audience, and there's a responsibility that goes with that. To some extent, I find myself having to be moral. I express the morality in my music. There's a certain amount of propagandizing in almost any kind of music, and that's okay. There's understanding that you don't want to feed people darkness or negativity. I write what's considered heavy-going kind of songs, but I don't see it as negative. I see it almost as a social necessity. Society is complex and strange and dark, and things happen.
Wow.
Nice.
That's very nice.
Choice.
Yes. He's a frequent visitor to Santa Barbara and plays at the Libero Theater. He's just a real gentleman. Of all the ones that you interviewed, nothing revealing here, because this book, there's nothing sordid about this book. It's just all about creativity. Did any of them really surprise you in terms of depth?
I was surprised by them all because I asked them all the question which supposedly you're never meant to ask an artist. It's like saying, where does the muse come from? And that was the question in that time that it was called peak experience, which this psychologist Abraham Maslow termed, when you feel a sense of something greater than yourself, and where words will just flow out of you. Or say David Crosby, I remember him saying when they were playing on stage and they were so connected, they'd all start the wrong verse at the same time. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they all talked about it willingly. And so they really went deep.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, and some said they would be asleep and they'd have to wake up because this little, either these lyrics came to them or a riff or something, and they'd have to write it down. If they didn't, it would go. And sometimes they would hear somebody else had picked it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. The fact that most of them still play, the ones that are alive still play.
Yeah.
And I'm not giving anything away by saying Stephen still goes over to Neil Young's house and they jam in the living room every week. It's incredible.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about your sense of your view on creativity since you've spent all this time with all of these people.
Well, I think the interesting thing is I was a typical example of someone who was doing something creative but thought she wasn't. Thought she wasn't creative. So I've written poems ever since I could write pretty much.
Yeah.
And that's how I always express myself. Whether it's like talking to myself, being upset about something, I have to write it down. And then halfway down the page, and I never see where it is, it tells me what to do. So it's almost like another part of you.
Yeah.
So writing has always been my thing. But I never thought, because look what I had to compare myself to. the Beatles, Fleetwood Mac, you know, it's sort of course you're not going to feel creative.
But you wrote songs for Fleetwood Mac.
Well, one of them was July Judy that Chris and I wrote together, and that was about our friend Judy Wong, and so we wrote that together, and then of course they put the music to it. And the other one was Danny Kerwin, who used to be in Fleetwood Mac. They were a bit short of lyrics when Peter Green left, and so he asked to see all my poems. So he picked out one of my poems called The Purple Dancer.
And used that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, you're trained to be a psychologist, a counselor, therapist. I'm wondering, when you approach some of these people to interview, did you kind of go in that mode, or did you stay away?
No, I didn't, because at that time I'd got my master's in counselling psychology. But I didn't think, oh, well, now I'll ask them this because I know that's very good. You know, it was almost my interest, me, coming from me, and who I was, and that's where it came from.
Okay, all right.
I happened to, I suppose, learn when to ask a question, or when we're halfway through an answer and they think they've answered the question, just to stay quiet, just stay with them for a minute, and then they'd start to go deeper, you know. So I did learn that, just staying there with them.
And they would think of something and begin speaking.
Yeah.
Yes. It always worked.
It always worked.
That's great. I got a couple more questions, and we'll open it up to you all. One guy that's not in here is Donovan.
Well, I wonder why that is. Actually, I had no idea. I knew he lived in Ireland for a while, and I'd seen him. I'd gone to one of his gigs at my now husband's old school, and he was very sweet, but he had this sort of long black hair like a magician, and he just spoke in rhyme the whole time. And then after the show, he did Juniper, and after the show we went to the master's study, and he wrote this lovely little note for me about old friends and how precious they are. So that was nice.
You still have the note?
I do.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
Did you, when you're on the road and through your travels, did you collect things, like things written down or pictures drawn by these artists?
No. I'll tell you a very sad story. When we were in India, and we'd go up on the roof, and there'd be John and George and Paul, and they'd be writing their songs and playing their music and everything. And then one day, in my meditation, because everyone was trying to meditate for like 1, 2, 3 days at a time, so I thought, well, I think I'll go for 2 days. And so I was sitting on the floor, leaning against my bed, started meditating. Halfway through the night, I felt really hot and terrible headache and sweating, and obviously I was really ill. And so I went out and to try and wake Maharishi up, and said, I'm not well, you know, I'm really, really boiling. He said, oh, go back and meditate. You're hitting an iceberg. And an iceberg meant something that hadn't actually resolved yet. And you've gone so deep, and you've come up, and you haven't resolved whatever it was. So I went back, and I was sort of trying to meditate, and finally I just collapsed on the bed. And when my sister Patty came in the next morning, she took one look at me, and she said, oh my God, you know, we've got to call the doctor. So doctor was called. We were miles from anywhere, and he said, you've got tonsillitis. So I thought, well, that's weird. You know, I had my tonsils out when I was a kid. And then luckily another doctor happened to be around, and of course it was dysentery. So you know, you're in India, and you're you know. Anyway, so so then people would come and visit me, and one of the people who were visiting was John Lennon and Cynthia. And he had done this drawing for me. And so he gave me this drawing, and it was of this Indian man with a turban on his head, and he's playing a flute, and he's sitting cross-legged, and a basket's in front of him, and a snake's coming up out of the basket. And what he drew it, and what he put underneath was, by the power that's in and the power that's out, I cast your tonsil lighthouse out. Love, John and Sin. So I gave it to my mother to look after.
I'm not sure I want to hear the rest of
it. No. Yeah. But anyway, but I think my point is that was the only sort of drawing that, you know, I would have
Yes.
had.
But it is burned in your memory,
Exactly.
in your heart.
Yeah, yeah.
Do we have any questions about any? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk, very interesting. And I noticed Michael was sometimes pausing to let you go.
Keep
a bit.
going.
Yeah.
You learn.
But I'm wondering if you ever have the opportunity to interview some of these folks afterwards, sometime later, when they might be able to look back on what they said earlier, and whether they had any comments on
Yeah.
what they said
No,
earlier.
I didn't think of that. I mean, in this book I got four new interviews, but one of the interviews, actually it's 5, one of them is a Peter Green interview that I didn't actually interview him, but someone I know who's writing a book about him had interviewed me about my memories of Peter Green, and so I asked him, did he have answers to these particular questions that I gave him, and he did. So I got Peter Green in the book after he passed away. You know, so yeah, but that's a lovely thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Out of everybody you interviewed in your book, who was your favorite? And you have to pick them.
Oh, you're so
Oh.
cruel. Well, oh God, I would say, and this is right off the top of my head, I would say it was Eric Clapton. And the reason is, because I used to live around the corner from Patty and Eric. He was drinking and he was crazy and all that stuff, and it was for years. And when I interviewed him, so he'd tease me and I would cry, and you know, he was just awful. And then he'd hug me. You know, he's just sort of like a horrible older brother. And but then when I interviewed him, I sat just him and me in his house, and he was he'd stopped drinking, stopped using completely, and it was Eric as Eric. And so because it was quite recent that he'd stopped, he was very honest about drugs and alcohol, but about everything in life. And so it's like, I knew he always had something, but it was always masked over by, you know, substance abuse, basically.
Mm.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Tying into that, you did say that you asked everyone about drugs and alcohol, and with creativity,
Yeah.
I wonder if there's anything that comes to mind that were really insightful thoughts that they had around how drugs and alcohol either help or hinder creativity.
Yeah, I did ask them all that, and the interesting thing is a lot of people were in recovery, newly in recovery, and quite open about it, and so they were able to talk about what it was like. Like Bonnie Raitt would say, you know, when you have such a high, when you're on stage, you know, and everybody takes off and the audience takes off, what are you to do? Just go home and go to bed? You know, you want to keep that thing going, and often that's how they do it. And I think also a lot of artists are sort of sensitive, quite shy souls, and so I think it gives them that bit of confidence probably needed. So Joni Mitchell says, actually, although she talks about different elixirs and things to take, says the sober mind is the long distance runner of them all. And Eric Clapton also says, you know, that the drink that you're taking becomes more important than the creativity itself. You know, suddenly that takes over. You're always wanting.
Interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Enjoyed how you included Jacob Collier
Yeah.
as a contemporary among these creatives whose rise occurred in different decades. Who today, that's rising now, is a creative that you would love to have the opportunity to interview?
I would like to ask my granddaughter Izzy or Ruby and Tessa if they could choose someone, because sometimes Izzy lets me listen to music she's listening to, and I say, God, I love that, you know, but I'm not sure what their names are. Anyone?
That's gotta be Iz.
Izzy, where are you? There you are. Sorry.